My name is Evelyn Stewart, I'm 58 years old, and this is the story of how one Thanksgiving dinner taught me that sometimes the people who smile at your table are the same ones plotting to devour your life. What started as a family gathering in my own dining room ended with me realizing that my son's wife had been systematically destroying everything I'd built, one calculated insult at a time. But here's the thing about underestimating a woman who spent 30 years in international finance. We don't just get mad, we get methodical. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Thanksgiving started like every other holiday for the past 5 years. I was up at dawn, prep work spread across my kitchen island like a military operation. Turkey brining since Tuesday, homemade cranberry sauce cooling in glass jars, sweet potato casserole assembled and waiting for the oven. This wasn't just dinner, it was tradition. The kind of meal that takes 2 days to prepare and disappears in 20 minutes, leaving behind nothing but satisfied sighs and the promise that next year will be even better. I had bought a 14-pound heritage turkey from the farmer's market, the expensive kind that costs twice as much as the grocery store version, but tastes like actual food instead of processed foam. My dining room table was set with the china my mother gave me, the pattern she'd collected piece by piece during the early years of her marriage when money was tight but hope was endless. Crystal glasses caught the morning light streaming through the bay windows, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth I'd pressed the night before. Everything had to be perfect. Not because I'm a perfectionist, but because I knew Jessica would find something to critique. My daughter-in-law had a gift for spotting flaws that existed only in her imagination, then amplifying them until they became the central focus of any gathering. Last Easter, she'd spent 20 minutes explaining to everyone why store-bought rolls were basically poison, while eating 3 of them. The Christmas before that, she'd announced that my gift wrapping looked rustic, in a way that made it clear rustic was not a compliment. But I kept trying. I kept hosting, kept cooking, kept setting the table with my best dishes, because somewhere in my optimistic heart, I believed that eventually she'd run out of ammunition, that eventually we'd find our rhythm as family. I was wrong about a lot of things that year, but I was especially wrong about Jessica. My son Marcus arrived first, as he always did, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing that apologetic smile he'd perfected since getting married. He's 32 now, tall like his father was, with the same gentle eyes that used to look at me like I hung the moon. These days, those eyes carried a weight I recognized but pretended not to see. The weight of a man caught between 2 women who would never understand each other. Behind him came Jessica, holding their 2-year-old daughter Lily on her hip and scanning my kitchen with the expression of a health inspector who'd already decided to shut the place down. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, her blonde hair arranged in the kind of effortless waves that require an hour and 3 different styling tools to achieve. Beautiful, certainly. But there was something cold in her beauty, like looking at a painting behind bulletproof glass. Lily wiggled in her mother's arms, reaching toward me with the innocent enthusiasm that only toddlers possess. I held out my hands, and Jessica reluctantly passed her over, making sure to mention that Lily had already eaten lunch and wouldn't need anything until her scheduled snack time at 3:30. As if I didn't know how to feed a child. As if I hadn't raised Marcus from a colicky infant into the man standing in my kitchen, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was waiting for permission to exist. The first signs of trouble came during appetizers. I'd made stuffed mushrooms, the same recipe I'd been perfecting for 15 years. Filled with Italian sausage and breadcrumbs, and just enough Parmesan to make them irresistible. Marcus was on his 3rd one when Jessica made her first observation of the day. "These are interesting," she said, holding a mushroom at arm's length like it might explode. "Very heavy. I've been reading about how processed meats are linked to inflammation. Did you know that? The preservatives they use are basically the same chemicals they put in paint thinner." I forced a smile and continued arranging crackers on a serving plate. "I buy from the local butcher. He makes his own sausage, no preservatives." "Oh, that's sweet that you trust him," Jessica replied, setting the mushroom down untouched. "But unless you're watching him grind the meat yourself, you really can't know what's in it. I brought some organic kale chips just in case. They're in the car. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound a man makes when he's trying to disappear into his own skin. Lily babbled happily from her high chair, completely unaware that her mother had just managed to insult both my cooking and my intelligence in the span of 30 seconds. I handed Lily a small piece of dinner roll, which she immediately began dissecting with the focused intensity of a tiny scientist. The kale chips never made it inside. Jessica spent the next 20 minutes scrolling through her phone while I finished the final preparations, occasionally looking up to comment on how rustic everything looked, or to suggest that maybe next year we should simplify the menu. Each suggestion felt like a paper cut, small and sharp and designed to sting just enough to remind me that I was being judged. But I kept cooking. I kept smiling. I kept pretending that her comments were helpful rather than hostile, because that's what you do when you love your son and want to see your granddaughter grow up knowing her family. You swallow the small humiliations and hope they don't accumulate into something larger, something that might poison the very thing you're trying to protect. The turkey came out perfectly, golden brown and glistening, the kind of centerpiece that belongs on magazine covers. I carved it at the kitchen counter, arranging the slices on my grandmother's serving platter, the one with the tiny chip on the rim that somehow made it more precious rather than less. Steam rose from the stuffing as I spooned it into a bowl, the sage and celery scents mixing with the smell of gravy that had been simmering slowly for the past hour. "Dinner's ready," I called, wiping my hands on the apron my mother had embroidered with tiny turkeys around the border. It was old-fashioned and probably looked ridiculous, but it was mine, and wearing it made me feel connected to every woman who had ever stood in a kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, hoping her efforts would bring her family together, rather than drive them apart. We gathered around the table, Marcus pulling out Jessica's chair with the automatic courtesy he'd learned as a child, Lily secured in her booster seat with a plastic bib shaped like a pumpkin. The table looked exactly like I'd envisioned it, an abundance of food arranged around the centerpiece of autumn leaves I'd collected from my backyard maple tree. Golden light filtered through the dining room windows, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that this might be the Thanksgiving where everything clicked into place. Marcus said grace, his voice warm and familiar as he thanked God for family and food and the opportunity to gather together. Lily clapped her hands when he finished, delighted by the ritual even if she didn't understand the words. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of tension I'd been carrying all morning, finally beginning to unravel. Then Jessica opened her mouth. "Well, this is certainly ambitious," she said, surveying the spread with the expression of someone who'd discovered a crime scene. "I'm not sure we'll be able to eat even half of this. It's so wasteful, making this much food for 4 people. Don't you think about your carbon footprint, Evelyn? All those ingredients, all that energy to cook everything." The knot in my chest tightened again, pulling tighter than before. "I like having leftovers," I said carefully. "Marcus always takes containers home." "That's part of the problem," Jessica continued, serving herself microscopic portions of everything, while somehow making it look like a moral stance. "We're trying to eat cleaner now. Less processed food, fewer calories, more mindful consumption. Lily's eating habits are being established right now, and we want to model healthy behaviors." She said this while completely ignoring the fact that every single dish on the table had been made from scratch, using ingredients I'd sourced from local farms and markets. The green bean casserole was made with fresh beans I'd blanched myself, the mashed potatoes were from actual potatoes I'd peeled by hand, and the cranberry sauce contained exactly 3 ingredients: cranberries, orange juice, and a touch of honey. But pointing this out would only invite more criticism, more lectures about things I'd supposedly done wrong. So I focused on cutting Lily's turkey into tiny pieces, making sure each bite was cool enough for her sensitive mouth, pretending not to notice that Jessica was photographing her plate with her phone, probably to post later with some caption about surviving family dinner or teaching gratitude in challenging circumstances. Marcus tried to fill the silence with compliments about the food, praising everything from the texture of the stuffing to the seasoning on the green beans. His words were genuine, I could tell, but they felt desperate, like he was trying to build a wall of positivity strong enough to keep his wife's negativity from poisoning the entire meal. It wasn't working. "The turkey's a little dry," Jessica announced after her 3rd bite. "Did you use a meat thermometer? You really need to be careful with poultry. Food poisoning is no joke, especially with a toddler in the house." The turkey was not dry. I'd been cooking Thanksgiving dinner since before Jessica was born, and I knew the difference between perfectly cooked poultry and cardboard. The meat was tender enough to cut with a fork, juicy enough that each slice glistened on the plate. But apparently, that didn't matter. What mattered was that Jessica needed to establish her superiority, her expertise, her right to judge everything I did in my own kitchen.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I've been cooking for 35 years, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the anger building in my throat. I think I know how to handle a turkey. Experience doesn't always equal expertise, Jessica replied with a smile that never reached her eyes. I've been researching food safety protocols since Lily was born. Did you know that even a few degrees can mean the difference between safe and dangerous? And at your age, you might not notice the subtle changes in texture that indicate overcooking. At your age. 3 words that hit like a slap across the face. I was 58, not 88. I ran 5 miles every morning, managed a portfolio of international investments, and could still outcook most people half my age. But somehow, in Jessica's narrative, I was a doddering old woman too confused to operate a meat thermometer. Lily chose that moment to knock over her sippy cup, sending apple juice cascading across the tablecloth and onto the floor. It was an accident, the kind of thing toddlers do approximately every 15 minutes. But Jessica's reaction was immediate and theatrical. "Oh my God, Lily! I told you to be careful!" She jumped up, grabbing napkins and shooting accusatory looks in my direction, as if I'd personally sabotaged the cup's stability. This is exactly what I was worried about. The cups are too big for her hands, and the table is too high. She can't eat properly in this setup. I got up to help clean the spill, but Jessica waved me away with an irritated gesture. "I've got it. You just sit down and enjoy your dry turkey." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Marcus looked mortified, his face flushing red, as he realized his wife had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But he didn't say anything. He never said anything. He just sat there, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, caught between defending his mother and keeping peace with his wife, ultimately choosing neither option and accomplishing nothing. I remained standing, watching Jessica make a production of cleaning up 3 tablespoons of apple juice, while muttering under her breath about proper childproofing and, quote, age-appropriate dining situations. Something inside me shifted, a tectonic plate of patience that had been under pressure for 5 years finally beginning to crack. But I didn't explode. I didn't scream or throw dishes or storm out of my own dining room. Instead, I excused myself to get a fresh tablecloth from the linen closet, taking the long way through the hallway that was lined with photographs of Marcus at every stage of his life. Marcus learning to walk, Marcus graduating high school, Marcus in his college cap and gown, Marcus on his wedding day with his arm around a woman who was already planning to erase me from his life, one criticism at a time. In the linen closet, surrounded by the smell of lavender sachets and the familiar comfort of things I'd chosen and cared for over decades, I made a decision. Not the final decision that would come later, but the first decision, the one that would set everything else in motion. I decided to stop pretending that Jessica's behavior was acceptable. I decided to stop making excuses for her cruelty and my son's cowardice. I decided to start paying attention to what was really happening in my own house. When I returned to the dining room with a fresh tablecloth, Jessica was holding court about the importance of establishing boundaries with grandparents who overstep by buying too many toys or offering unsolicited advice. She wasn't looking at me directly, but the message was clear. I was the grandmother who overstepped. I was the problem that needed managing. Some older people struggle with the transition, she was saying to Marcus, while spooning microscopic bites of sweet potato into Lily's mouth. They remember raising their own children, but they don't understand that parenting has evolved. We know so much more now about nutrition, development, emotional intelligence. It's not their fault they're out of touch, but we can't let nostalgia override what's best for our family. Our family. Not the family. Our family. A unit that apparently included Marcus, Jessica, and Lily, but specifically excluded me. I was the outdated relic, the well-meaning but ultimately useless woman, whose primary function was to be managed and contained. I spread the fresh tablecloth over the table, smoothing out wrinkles with practiced efficiency, while Jessica continued her lecture about modern parenting techniques. She mentioned sleep training methods I'd never heard of, feeding schedules based on developmental psychology, and the importance of limiting sugar exposure during crucial brain development periods. All of this delivered while eating my homemade apple pie, which I'd apparently sweetened with poison instead of the organic honey I'd actually used. Of course, some grandparents take it personally when you set boundaries, Jessica continued, her voice taking on the faux concerned tone of someone discussing a tragedy that didn't actually affect them. They think it's about rejection, but it's really about protection. We have to protect our children from outdated ideas about discipline, nutrition, safety. Even if it hurts some feelings. The words hit their target with surgical precision. I felt each one like a separate wound, small but deep, designed to damage without leaving visible scars. This wasn't casual cruelty or thoughtless rudeness. This was calculated psychological warfare, delivered with the kind of smile that would look perfectly innocent to anyone watching from the outside. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his discomfort obvious but useless. Mom's been great with Lily, he said weakly. The protest of a man who knew he was required to say something but had no intention of meaning it. Oh, absolutely, Jessica agreed, her smile widening into something that resembled genuine warmth if you weren't paying attention to her eyes. Evelyn tries so hard. It's actually sweet how much effort she puts into these elaborate meals and decorations. Very old-fashioned. Very quaint. Quaint. Like I was a museum exhibit. Charming in my irrelevance. Entertaining in my inability to adapt to the modern world. I finished adjusting the tablecloth and sat back down, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest like steam in a kettle with a broken whistle. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of backhanded compliments and thinly veiled insults. Jessica praised my ambitious menu while explaining why she and Marcus were transitioning to a more sustainable approach to holiday celebrations. She complimented my vintage china while mentioning that they were planning to register for new dishes that were more practical for everyday use. She admired my traditional decorating style while describing the minimalist aesthetic they were creating in their own home. Every compliment was a criticism in disguise. Every observation was a judgment wrapped in false kindness. And through it all, Marcus said nothing. He ate his food, made small talk about work, and played peekaboo with Lily, but he never once asked his wife to moderate her tone or consider my feelings. He had made his choice years ago, and it wasn't me. When Lily started fussing, Jessica announced that it was time for them to leave. She needs her nap, she explained, gathering up the diaper bag and various toys with the efficiency of someone eager to escape a contaminated area. We don't want to disrupt her schedule too much. Consistency is so important at this age. The implication was clear. Staying longer would be harmful to their child, and I was the source of that harm. My house, my food, my very presence was something they needed to protect Lily from. I was not a grandmother to be cherished, but a hazard to be managed. I hugged Lily goodbye, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair while she babbled about the gobble-gobble turkey we'd seen in one of her picture books. She had no idea that this might be the last Thanksgiving dinner we'd share for a very long time. She was 2 years old, living in the moment, trusting that the adults in her life would make decisions based on love rather than spite. Marcus hugged me at the front door, holding on a little longer than usual, as if he could somehow transfer an apology through physical contact. Thanks for dinner, Mom, he said quietly. Everything was perfect. Perfect except for his wife's behavior, perfect except for his silence, perfect except for the growing realization that I was being systematically erased from my own family. But I didn't say any of that. I just smiled and told him to drive safely and call me when they got home. Jessica offered a brief, cold embrace, the kind of hug you give someone you're obligated to touch but would prefer to avoid. Thank you for having us, she said with the polite indifference of a dinner guest who would never return by choice. Next year, maybe we can do something simpler, more low-key. More low-key meant less involved, which meant less me. It was another boundary being established, another wall being built. Another step in the process of making me irrelevant to my son's life. I nodded and smiled and wished them safe travels. playing my role as the gracious hostess even as I began planning my exit from the entire production. After they left, I stood in my dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the meal I'd spent 3 days preparing. Dirty dishes covered every surface, the once pristine tablecloth was stained with gravy and cranberry sauce, and the house felt eerily quiet after hours of tension disguised as conversation. I should have felt relieved that it was over, but instead I felt something much more dangerous. I felt clarity. For 5 years, I'd been making excuses for Jessica's behavior, telling myself that she was young, that she was stressed, that she needed time to adjust to being part of an established family. I'd convinced myself that her criticisms came from insecurity rather than malice, that her boundaries were reasonable rather than designed to isolate me from my son and granddaughter. But standing there in the wreckage of another ruined holiday, I finally saw the truth. Jessica didn't dislike me because I was overbearing or outdated or difficult to get along with. She disliked me because I existed. Because I represented a connection between Marcus and a life that existed before her. A relationship she couldn't control or rewrite to suit her narrative. She wanted to be the only woman in his life, the only voice he trusted, the only opinion that mattered when it came to raising their daughter. And the only way to achieve that was to systematically destroy my credibility, my confidence, and my connection to the family I'd helped create. I picked up a serving spoon covered in congealed gravy and felt something shift inside me, like the click of a lock finally turning. For 5 years, I'd been playing defense, absorbing her attacks, and trying to prove that I was worthy of basic respect and inclusion. But defense doesn't win wars. It just prolongs them. I walked into my home office, a small room adjacent to the kitchen that I'd converted into a workspace when I started managing investments from home. The walls were lined with financial publications, certification awards, and photographs from various conferences I'd attended over the years. This was the room where I'd built a career that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or grandmother, where I'd proven my competence in ways that had nothing to do with cooking turkeys or folding fitted sheets. I sat down at my computer and opened the files I kept on offshore investment accounts, the ones I'd established years ago when Marcus was still in college, and I was planning for a future that might include international travel, property purchases, or emergency funds that couldn't be easily traced or accessed by anyone else. The accounts had grown substantially over the years, fed by bonuses and careful reinvestment strategies, sitting quietly in various financial institutions across 3 different countries. Jessica thought I was useless, an outdated relic who needed to be managed and contained. She had no idea that the woman she'd been systematically insulting controlled assets worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. She had no idea that I'd spent 30 years learning how money moved through international markets, how to hide assets, how to make financial problems disappear, and how to make financial solutions appear exactly when and where they were needed most. But she was about to find out. I opened a new document and began typing, creating a detailed timeline of every insult, every boundary, every calculated cruelty Jessica had inflicted over the past 5 years. Not because I was planning to use it in some kind of legal proceeding, but because I wanted to make sure I remembered everything when the time came to balance the scales. The woman who had called me useless at my own Thanksgiving table was going to learn what useful really looked like. And by the time I was finished, she was going to wish she'd been content with dry turkey and quaint decorations, because those were going to seem like the good old days compared to what was coming next. I typed until well past midnight, the clicking of keys the only sound in the house except for the occasional settling of walls and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and scattered the last of the autumn leaves across my front yard, but inside, everything was still and focused and absolutely clear. Jessica had made a critical error in judgment. She'd assumed that because I was older, quieter, more accommodating than she was, I was also weaker. She'd mistaken patience for powerlessness, kindness for stupidity, and love for something she could exploit without consequence. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of teaching her otherwise. Tomorrow, I would start dismantling the comfortable life she'd built on the foundation of my son's silence and my own tolerance. Tomorrow, I would show her what happened when you called a woman useless, who had spent decades learning exactly the opposite. But tonight, I sat in my quiet office, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd accomplished without her permission or approval, and planned the most methodical, devastating, and ultimately satisfying response to 5 years of systematic disrespect. The turkey might have been dry, but my revenge was going to be perfect. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've spent 8 hours dreaming about all the things you should have said but didn't. My house still smelled like turkey and disappointment, dirty dishes stacked in the sink like evidence of my own foolishness. But instead of the usual post-holiday melancholy, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Focused anger with a purpose. I made coffee using the French press Marcus had given me for my birthday 3 years ago, back when Jessica still pretended to approve of his gifts to me. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning her downfall while using something my son had chosen specifically. Because he knew I'd appreciate the ritual of making coffee by hand, the patience required to let it steep properly, the satisfaction of pressing down the plunger and watching the grounds separate from the liquid. While the coffee steeped, I opened my laptop and began researching Jessica's digital footprint with the methodical thoroughness I'd once applied to due diligence reports for potential investments. Social media accounts, professional profiles, shopping patterns, subscription services. People leave trails everywhere they go online, and Jessica was no exception. In fact, she was remarkably careless for someone who claimed to be so concerned about privacy and security. Her Instagram account was public, filled with carefully curated photos of her life with Marcus and Lily. Every image was filtered and staged, from the artfully messy breakfast shots to the candid moments that had clearly required multiple takes to achieve the right balance of spontaneity and perfection. The captions were worse than the photos, dripping with humble bragging about their organic lifestyle, their mindful parenting choices, their commitment to sustainable living. But it was the stories that revealed the most. Jessica shared everything in her temporary posts, apparently forgetting that screenshots exist and people pay attention. Complaints about expensive car repairs, celebrations of Marcus getting promoted at work, frustrations about their mortgage payment increasing, excitement about a vacation they were planning for the spring. She painted a picture of a young family living well, but always one financial crisis away from serious trouble. I took careful notes, creating a spreadsheet that would have impressed my former colleagues at the investment firm. Income sources, monthly expenses, debt obligations, spending patterns, financial vulnerabilities. Jessica and Marcus were living paycheck to paycheck, despite appearing prosperous on social media. They had a car payment that consumed nearly 20% of Marcus's take-home pay, a mortgage on a house they'd bought at the peak of the market, and credit card debt that Jessica tried to hide behind designer handbags and organic groceries. More importantly, they were completely dependent on the gifts and financial support I'd been providing for years without really thinking about it. The down payment assistance I'd given them for their house, the car I'd helped them buy when Jessica's old Honda finally died, the credit card I'd added Marcus to years ago for emergencies, which had somehow become their primary funding source for everything from date nights to home improvements. Jessica thought I was useless, but my bank statements told a different story. Over the past 5 years, I'd contributed nearly $40,000 to their household in direct payments, gifts, and subsidies they'd grown so accustomed to receiving that they probably forgot where the money came from. They'd built their comfortable lifestyle on the foundation of my generosity, then had the audacity to treat me like an inconvenience they were forced to tolerate. That was about to change. I spent the next 3 hours making phone calls, starting with the credit card company that managed the account Marcus was authorized to use. The customer service representative was apologetic but firm when I explained that I needed to remove an authorized user immediately due to suspicious activity. Within 10 minutes, Marcus's access was revoked, and a new card was being expedited to my address only. Next, I called the bank that held their mortgage. I'd co-signed the loan when their debt-to-income ratio wasn't quite strong enough to qualify for the amount they wanted to borrow. It had seemed like a reasonable favor at the time, helping my son and his wife buy a house in a good school district where Lily could grow up safely. Now, I was curious about the terms of my liability and what options might be available if I wanted to remove myself from the obligation. The conversation was illuminating. As a co-signer, I had significant leverage over the loan, including the right to demand immediate payment if I felt the primary borrowers were at risk of default. More interestingly, there was a clause in the original agreement that allowed me to transfer my portion of the obligation to a third party, effectively selling my interest in the loan to an entity that might be more aggressive about collecting payments. I didn't make any changes that day, but I took detailed notes about my options. Jessica had spent 5 years treating me like I was powerless, but power in America flows along with money, and I had far more of both than she realized. The most interesting discovery came when I started researching the company where Marcus worked. He'd been promoted recently to a senior position in their marketing department, a job that came with better pay, but also increased scrutiny and higher expectations. His employer was a mid-sized firm that provided consulting services to local businesses, the kind of company that relied heavily on maintaining a professional reputation and avoiding any hint of scandal or controversy. I knew from Jessica's social media posts that Marcus's promotion had come with a significant increase in responsibility, including client presentations and public speaking engagements. She'd posted photos of him at various business events, always careful to tag the company and highlight his growing importance in the organization. She was proud of his success, as she should be, but she was also creating a digital record of exactly how much he had to lose if that success were threatened. I bookmarked several pages and closed my laptop, satisfied with the morning's research. The information gathering phase was complete, and now it was time to move to the next stage of my plan. But first, I needed to take care of some practical matters, starting with the dishes that had been soaking in my sink since yesterday afternoon. As I scrubbed cranberry sauce off my grandmother's serving platter, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard between Marcus and Jessica while they were getting Lily ready to leave. They'd been in the living room, speaking in the kind of hushed tones parents use when they think their children can't hear them, but I'd been clearing dishes from the dining room and caught every word. She seemed more sensitive than usual, Marcus had said, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd been having the same conversation for years. She's getting older, Jessica had replied, her voice devoid of sympathy. Older people get emotional about things that don't really matter. The turkey was fine, but she acted like I'd insulted her entire identity. Maybe you could try being a little gentler with your feedback, Marcus had suggested, the words carrying no real conviction. She works really hard on these dinners. I'm not going to lie to make her feel better, Jessica had responded firmly. That's not doing anyone any favors. If the food isn't good, pretending it is doesn't help her improve. And honestly, Marcus, some of her cooking is getting pretty questionable. What if Lily gets sick from something that wasn't prepared properly? The accusation that I might poison my own granddaughter had been the final straw, the moment I'd stopped making excuses for Jessica's behavior and started planning my response. She hadn't just insulted my cooking or questioned my competence. She'd implied that I was a danger to my own family, someone who couldn't be trusted with the most basic task of preparing safe food. I finished the dishes and dried my hands on the turkey-embroidered towel, then walked back to my office to make the next series of phone calls. These conversations would be more delicate, requiring the kind of diplomatic language I'd perfected during my years in finance. When a misplaced word could cost millions of dollars and destroy carefully built relationships. The first call was to my accountant, a woman named Patricia who'd been managing my tax obligations for over a decade. She was discreet, competent, and completely uninterested in the personal drama that motivated her clients' financial decisions. When I explained that I wanted to restructure some of my gift-giving patterns and explore options for reducing my tax exposure related to family contributions, she asked practical questions about amounts and timelines without once inquiring about my motivations. If you've been providing regular support to family members, there are several strategies we can explore, Patricia explained, her voice crisp and professional. Gift tax implications, dependency status changes, educational funding restructuring. Are we talking about a temporary adjustment or a permanent change in your giving patterns? Permanent, I said without hesitation. I'm reevaluating all of my financial relationships and support structures. I want to ensure that my resources are being directed toward people and causes that align with my values and treat me with appropriate respect. Patricia made some notes and promised to send me a comprehensive analysis within the week. She'd prepare documents that would allow me to formally withdraw support from various individuals and redirect those funds toward other purposes, including charitable donations that would provide significant tax benefits, while ensuring that my money went to organizations that appreciated it. The second call was to my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Chen, who specialized in family law and estate planning. I'd used her services when I was updating my will a few years earlier, and I'd been impressed by her ability to ask the right questions without making assumptions about my personal relationships. "I want to make some changes to my estate planning documents," I told her after the preliminary pleasantries were finished. "Specifically, I'm reconsidering some of the provisions related to support for family members and their children." Rebecca's pause was professional, rather than judgmental. "Are you looking at changes to beneficiary designations, or are you more concerned with adjusting the terms of specific bequests?" "Both," I said. "I want to ensure that my estate planning reflects my current understanding of family dynamics and the likelihood that certain relationships will remain positive over time. I'm also interested in exploring options for creating conditions that beneficiaries would need to meet in order to receive inheritances." We scheduled an appointment for the following week, and Rebecca promised to review my existing documents before our meeting. She'd prepare several different scenarios for restructuring my will and trust arrangements, including options that would protect my assets from being inherited by people who had demonstrated disrespect or ingratitude during my lifetime. The third call was the most important, and also the most delicate. I dialed the number for James Morrison, a private investigator I'd met several years earlier when my investment firm needed background checks on potential partners. James was thorough, discreet, and absolutely ruthless when it came to uncovering information that people preferred to keep hidden. "Evelyn," he said warmly when his secretary transferred my call. "It's been a while. What can I do for you?" "I need a comprehensive background check on someone," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Financial history, employment record, educational credentials, social media analysis, spending patterns, debt obligations, everything that's legally accessible." "Personal or professional matter?" James asked, his tone shifting to the neutral professionalism that meant he was already taking notes. "Personal," I admitted. "Family-related. I'm concerned about some inconsistencies between what someone has told me about their background and what I'm observing in their behavior and lifestyle." "Understood," James said. "I'll need full name, date of birth, current address, and social security number if you have it. Standard background check runs about $1,500, but if you want the comprehensive package with financial analysis and behavioral profiling, we're looking at closer to $3,000. "Comprehensive package," I said without hesitation. "Money is not a concern." I gave him Jessica's information, gathered from years of birthday cards and insurance forms and casual conversations where she'd mentioned details about her past. James promised to have preliminary results within a week and a full report within 2 weeks, depending on how much information was readily available versus how much would require deeper investigation. After I finished the phone calls, I sat in my office chair and looked around at the space I'd created for myself over the years. Diplomas and certifications covered one wall, proof of the expertise I'd developed in fields that Jessica clearly knew nothing about. Photographs from business conferences and award ceremonies showed me in professional settings, surrounded by colleagues who respected my opinions and valued my contributions. This was who I really was, not the bumbling grandmother Jessica had tried to create in her mind. I was a woman who had built a successful career in a male-dominated industry, who had managed millions of dollars in investments, who had navigated complex international regulations and tax codes. I was someone who understood how power worked and how to use financial leverage to achieve specific goals. Jessica had made the mistake of assuming that because I chose to express my love through cooking and gift-giving, I was somehow weak or naive. She'd confused kindness with ignorance, generosity with desperation, and patience with powerlessness. But patience wasn't powerlessness, it was strategy. And my strategy was about to shift from defensive to offensive. I opened my laptop again and began drafting a letter that would never be sent but needed to be written for my own clarity. It was addressed to Jessica, and it contained everything I wished I'd said during her years of systematic disrespect. "Dear Jessica," I typed. "You called me useless yesterday, and I want to thank you for that clarity. For 5 years, I've been trying to understand why you seemed so determined to make me feel unwelcome in my own son's life, and your comment finally helped me realize that this was never about my behavior or your comfort. This was about your need to establish dominance over someone you perceived as a threat to your control over Marcus and Lily." I paused, considering my words carefully. The letter would never be delivered, but writing it helped me organize my thoughts and clarify my objectives. You've spent years criticizing my cooking, my parenting advice, my gifts, my home, and my very existence in your family's life. You've established boundaries designed to minimize my involvement with my granddaughter, and you've manipulated my son into believing that your hostility toward me is somehow justified by my supposed overstepping. The cursor blinked patiently as I gathered my thoughts. But here's what you don't understand about calling someone useless, Jessica. When you dismiss someone's value, you're essentially giving them permission to stop providing it. When you treat someone's contributions as worthless, you're telling them they have nothing to lose by withdrawing those contributions entirely. I typed faster now, the words flowing with the momentum of 5 years of suppressed frustration. You've built your comfortable lifestyle on the foundation of my financial support, emotional labor, and unconditional love for my son. You've taken my generosity for granted while simultaneously treating me like an unwanted burden. You've accepted my money while rejecting my presence, benefited from my sacrifices while mocking my efforts. The document was becoming longer than I'd intended, but I couldn't stop writing. 5 years of careful politeness and swallowed insults were pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. You think I'm useless because I'm older, because I express my love through traditional means, because I don't share your obsession with organic food and minimalist aesthetics. But usefulness isn't about age or style preferences, Jessica. It's about results. And the results speak for themselves. I saved the document and closed the laptop, satisfied that I'd articulated my feelings clearly, even if no one else would ever read them. The exercise had helped me refine my objectives and confirm that my planned response was proportional to the offense. Jessica had declared war on my place in the family, and now she was going to learn what happened when you picked a fight with someone who actually knew how to win. The rest of the afternoon was spent in practical preparations. I gathered financial documents related to all the support I'd provided to Marcus and Jessica over the years, creating a comprehensive record of my contributions to their household. The amounts were staggering when added together, and I realized that I'd been essentially subsidizing their lifestyle to the tune of nearly $8,000 per year for the past 5 years. $8,000 that had bought me nothing but criticism and contempt. $8,000 that had enabled Jessica to treat me like a relevant old woman while living in a house I'd helped them buy, driving a car I'd helped them finance, and raising a child whose needs I'd helped them meet. $8,000 that was about to disappear from their budget permanently, creating a financial crisis that would force them to confront the reality of their actual economic situation. I also spent time researching Jessica's background more thoroughly, using the same investigative techniques I'd learned during my years in finance. Public records, property tax information, court filings, bankruptcy databases, credit reports. The picture that emerged was fascinating and deeply troubling. Jessica had lied about significant portions of her past, starting with her educational credentials. She claimed to have graduated from a prestigious private college with a degree in early childhood development, but there was no record of her attendance at that institution. The degree she actually held was from a community college, in a general studies program that had no specific focus on child development or education. More concerning were the financial red flags in her background. She'd filed for bankruptcy shortly before meeting Marcus, discharging nearly $30,000 in credit card debt and medical bills. The bankruptcy filing included details about her spending patterns that painted a picture of someone who routinely lived beyond her means and then sought legal protection when the bills came due. There were also records of several civil judgments against her for unpaid debts, including amounts owed to former landlords, utility companies, and even a previous employer who had sued her for failing to repay in advance on her salary. The pattern was clear. Jessica was someone who took what she could get and then found ways to avoid paying it back. Armed with this information, I began to understand her hostility toward me in a completely different context. It wasn't just about establishing dominance or protecting her nuclear family from outside interference. It was about eliminating a witness to her financial irresponsibility and preventing me from potentially discovering the truth about her background. She needed Marcus to see her as the responsible, educated, sophisticated woman she pretended to be on social media. My presence in their lives represented a threat to that carefully constructed image, because I was the kind of person who might ask uncomfortable questions about discrepancies between her claims and reality. But more than that, she needed to maintain control over the financial narrative in their household. As long as Marcus believed that their comfortable lifestyle was the result of his hard work and her careful budgeting, she could continue taking credit for achievements that were actually funded by my contributions. If he ever realized how much of their security depended on my ongoing support, it might undermine her position as the capable partner who had helped him build a successful life. Jessica had spent 5 years systematically undermining my relationship with my son and granddaughter, not because I was actually overstepping or interfering, but because my very existence threatened the fraudulent foundation of her entire adult life. She needed me gone so she could continue pretending to be someone she wasn't, while simultaneously depending on resources I provided to maintain the lifestyle that supported her deception. The scope of her manipulation was breathtaking, and it explained why she'd been so determined to make me feel unwelcome despite the obvious financial cost of alienating me. She was willing to risk losing my support because she believed she could manipulate Marcus into replacing it with increased income or additional debt. She thought she could eliminate me as a factor in their lives while maintaining the benefits I provided through other means. She was wrong about that, just as she'd been wrong about calling me useless. But she was going to have to learn those lessons the hard way, through the kind of systematic financial pressure that would force her to confront the reality of her situation without the safety net she'd taken for granted. I spent the evening updating my records and preparing documentation that would be needed for the various changes I was planning to implement. Bank account modifications, credit card cancellations, legal document revisions, gift tax adjustments. Each change was small by itself, but together they would create a cascade of financial consequences that would fundamentally alter Marcus and Jessica's economic reality. By the time I went to bed that night, I had a clear timeline for implementing my response to Jessica's years of disrespect. Phase 1 would involve the immediate withdrawal of financial support, creating cash flow problems that would force them to confront their actual spending patterns. Phase 2 would address longer-term obligations and dependencies, including the mortgage co-signing and credit arrangements that gave me significant leverage over their major expenses. Phase 3, if necessary, would involve the strategic release of information about Jessica's background and financial history, ensuring that Marcus understood exactly who he'd married and what kind of future he was building with someone who had such a casual relationship with honesty and responsibility. But I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I hoped that the financial pressure alone would be enough to force Jessica to reconsider her treatment of me, and to make Marcus realize that his silence in the face of her hostility had consequences he couldn't afford to ignore. Jessica had called me useless, but she was about to discover that usefulness was a two-way street. If I was truly as irrelevant as she claimed, then my absence from their lives should be easy to absorb. If I was actually as valuable as my financial contributions suggested, then losing me was going to hurt in ways she hadn't considered. Either way, she was about to find out exactly how useful I really was, and exactly how much her comfortable life had depended on the generosity of the woman she'd been systematically insulting for 5 years. The woman she'd called useless was about to teach her a lesson about consequences that she'd remember for the rest of her life. The first phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving. I was drinking my coffee and reading the financial news when Marcus's name appeared on my caller ID. His voice carried a tension I hadn't heard since his college years, when he'd called to tell me he'd failed his economics midterm and might lose his scholarship. "Mom, I need to ask you something," he said without his usual pleasantries. "Did you cancel my credit card?" I set down my coffee cup and smiled at the newspaper spread across my kitchen table. "I removed you as an authorized user from my account," I said calmly. It was time to simplify my financial arrangements. "But I was counting on that card for Christmas shopping," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Jessica and I have been planning Lily's birthday party, and we budgeted based on having access to that credit line." "Then I suppose you'll need to adjust your budget," I replied, turning a page of the newspaper as if this conversation was no more significant than discussing the weather. "Surely a family with your income level can manage holiday expenses without depending on someone else's credit." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear him trying to figure out how to respond. Marcus had inherited his father's gentle nature, but he'd never developed the backbone that might have helped him navigate difficult conversations. He was caught between his wife's expectations and his mother's new boundaries, and he clearly had no idea how to resolve the conflict. "It's just that we've gotten used to having that safety net," he finally said. With the new house payment and Lily's daycare costs, things are pretty tight some months. I understand, I said, my voice warm with the kind of maternal sympathy that made my next words even more devastating. That's exactly why I decided it was time for you to develop your own financial independence. You're a successful professional with a good income. You shouldn't need to rely on your mother's credit card to manage your household expenses. The silence stretched longer this time, and I knew he was processing the implications of what I'd said. For the first time in his adult life, he was being forced to confront the reality of his actual financial situation, rather than the comfortable fiction he'd been living with Jessica's help. Could we maybe talk about this in person? He asked finally. Jessica thinks there might be some kind of misunderstanding. Of course, Jessica thought it was a misunderstanding. In her mind, I was too old and confused to make deliberate financial decisions that might inconvenience her. She probably assumed this was some kind of banking error that could be corrected with a phone call and the right explanation. There's no misunderstanding, I said firmly. I'm making some changes to my financial arrangements, and one of those changes involves reducing my support for adult children who should be managing their own expenses. But you're welcome to come by this weekend if you'd like to discuss it. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The first domino had fallen exactly as I'd predicted. Marcus was confused and worried, but he wasn't angry yet. That would come later, when the other financial supports began disappearing, and he realized that this wasn't a temporary adjustment or a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right conversation. The next phase of my plan required more delicate timing. I waited until Thursday before making the call to the bank that held their mortgage. I'd spent considerable time reviewing the terms of my cosigner agreement, and I'd discovered something interesting buried in the fine print. As a cosigner, I had the right to request quarterly reports on the loan status, payment history, and any changes to the borrower's financial circumstances that might affect their ability to meet their obligations. I'd like to exercise my right to request a comprehensive loan review, I told the mortgage specialist who handled my call. I'm the cosigner on account number 44789123335, and I have some concerns about the primary borrower's ability to maintain their payment obligations. The specialist was polite but thorough in explaining the process. A loan review would involve a complete reassessment of Marcus and Jessica's financial situation, including employment verification, debt-to-income ratio analysis, and credit score evaluation. If the review revealed any significant changes in their circumstances that increased the risk of default, the bank would have several options for protecting their investment. What kind of options? I asked, though I already knew the answer from my research. Depending on the findings, we might require additional collateral, demand a higher interest rate to reflect increased risk, or in extreme cases, demand immediate payment of the outstanding balance, she explained. As the cosigner, you would be notified of any changes to the loan terms before they were implemented. I requested the loan review and hung up feeling pleased with my progress. The mortgage review would take several weeks to complete, but when it was finished, Marcus and Jessica would discover that their comfortable monthly payment was about to become significantly less comfortable. The review would also create a paper trail documenting their financial instability, which might prove useful later if more dramatic interventions became necessary. Over the next few days, I implemented the remaining elements of Phase 1 with methodical precision. I called the insurance company that provided coverage for Jessica's car and requested that my name be removed as the secondary contact and financial guarantor. I canceled the subscription services I'd been paying for on their behalf, including the premium streaming accounts and the organic grocery delivery service that Jessica had specifically requested. I also made a call to the daycare center, where Lily attended classes 3 days a week. I'd been paying for half of her tuition as a gift to help with their childcare costs, but I informed the director that my financial contribution would be ending at the close of the current billing cycle. The director was understanding, but concerned about whether the family would be able to maintain their enrollment without the assistance. We can certainly work with them on a payment plan if needed, the director assured me. But the full tuition is quite substantial for families in their income bracket. We've had other grandparents reduce their support during economic downturns, and it can be challenging for the parents to adjust their budgets quickly. Each phone call was a small act of liberation, a step toward freeing myself from the financial obligations I'd taken on out of love and generosity, only to have those gifts treated as entitlements by someone who clearly didn't appreciate their value. Jessica had called me useless, but every canceled service and withdrawn support was proof of exactly how useful I'd been to their household budget. The second phone call from Marcus came on Friday afternoon. This time his voice carried a different quality, less confusion and more panic. Several of the financial supports had disappeared simultaneously, and he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a temporary glitch or a simple misunderstanding. "Mom, the daycare called and said you're not paying for Lily's tuition anymore," he said without preamble. "And our insurance company wants to talk to us about some changes to Jessica's car coverage. What's going on?" "I'm restructuring my financial commitments," I said, using the same calm tone I'd perfected during difficult negotiations in my professional life. "I've decided to redirect my resources toward purposes that align better with my current priorities and values." "But we're family," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of desperation I'd never heard before. "You can't just cut us off without warning. We have obligations, commitments. Lily's birthday party is next month, and we've already sent out invitations." "I'm not cutting you off," I corrected gently. "I'm simply expecting you to handle your own financial responsibilities like the successful adults you claim to be. Jessica has made it very clear that she doesn't value my contributions to your family, so I'm respecting her wishes by reducing those contributions." There was a long pause, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in his head as he tried to figure out how to respond to that logic. How could he argue that they needed my financial support without admitting that Jessica had been ungrateful for receiving it? How could he demand that I continue subsidizing their lifestyle while simultaneously defending his wife's right to treat me with contempt? "Jessica didn't mean anything personal by her comments," he said finally, his voice taking on the pleading quality of someone who knew he was losing an argument but couldn't figure out how to change course. "She's just very particular about food safety, especially with Lily's allergies and everything." "Lily doesn't have any food allergies," I said quietly. "I've been present at every pediatrician appointment since she was born, and there's never been any mention of allergies or dietary restrictions. That's just another way Jessica tries to control what I'm allowed to feed my granddaughter." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Marcus knew I was right, but acknowledging it would mean admitting that his wife had been lying to create artificial barriers between me and Lily. It would mean recognizing that Jessica's hostility toward me wasn't based on legitimate concerns about safety or parenting philosophy, but on a desire to eliminate my influence from their family dynamic. "Look, maybe we could all sit down together and work this out," he suggested, his voice carrying the desperate optimism of someone who still believed that difficult problems could be solved through compromise and good intentions. "I'm sure if you and Jessica just talked through your differences, you could find some common ground." "I tried that approach for 5 years," I said firmly. I absorbed her criticism, adjusted my behavior to accommodate her preferences, and continued providing financial support even when she made it clear that my presence in your lives was unwelcome. But calling me useless at my own Thanksgiving table crossed a line that can't be uncrossed through conversation. "She was having a stressful day," Marcus said weakly. "The baby was fussy, she'd been up all night with work deadlines, and she didn't mean for it to sound as harsh as it came out." "Marcus," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades managing difficult people and complex situations. "Your wife has spent 5 years systematically insulting me, undermining my relationship with Lily, and treating my home like a restaurant she's forced to patronize, despite the poor quality of service. This wasn't one bad day or a single thoughtless comment. This was the culmination of a sustained campaign to make me feel unwelcome in my own son's life." I paused, letting that reality settle between us before continuing. "And more importantly, you've allowed it to happen. You've sat silently while she criticized my cooking, my parenting advice, my gifts, and my very presence at family gatherings. You've chosen to preserve peace in your marriage by sacrificing my dignity, and now you're surprised that I'm choosing to preserve my dignity by withdrawing from the arrangement entirely." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. Marcus knew it was true, but hearing it stated so directly forced him to confront his own role in creating the situation we were all now trapped in. He'd been so focused on avoiding conflict with Jessica that he'd failed to notice he was creating a much larger conflict with me. "What do you want us to do?" he asked finally, his voice small and defeated. "I want you to figure out how to manage your household expenses without depending on my financial support," I said simply. "I want you to have honest conversations with your wife about her treatment of your mother. And I want you to decide whether you're going to continue prioritizing her comfort over our relationship." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of having stated my position clearly and without apology. For 5 years, I'd been trying to manage Jessica's hostility through accommodation and patience, hoping that eventually she'd recognize my value and treat me with basic respect. But accommodation had only enabled her behavior, and patience had been interpreted as weakness. Now I was trying a different approach, one that forced all of us to confront the real dynamics of our family relationships. Jessica had built her identity as Marcus's wife on the foundation of being superior to his mother, more sophisticated, more educated, more capable of managing their household and raising their daughter. But that identity required my complicity, my willingness to accept the role of the incompetent older woman who needed to be managed and contained. I was no longer willing to play that role, and without my cooperation, the entire narrative Jessica had constructed began to collapse. If I wasn't actually incompetent, then her criticism wasn't helpful feedback. If I wasn't actually useless, then my withdrawal of support was a genuine loss rather than an empty threat. If I wasn't actually powerless, then her treatment of me had consequences she hadn't anticipated. The weekend passed quietly, with no additional phone calls from Marcus or surprise visits from Jessica. I used the time to finalize the next phase of my plan, which involved more significant changes to our financial relationship. The mortgage review I'd requested was proceeding on schedule, and I'd received preliminary reports suggesting that Marcus and Jessica's debt-to-income ratio had deteriorated significantly since the original loan was approved. More importantly, James Morrison had delivered his preliminary background report on Jessica, and the findings were even more damning than I'd anticipated. In addition to the bankruptcy filing and civil judgments I'd already discovered, he'd uncovered evidence of employment fraud at her previous job, where she'd been terminated for falsifying expense reports and claiming reimbursement for personal purchases. The pattern of deception and financial irresponsibility was consistent and long-standing, dating back to her early 20s and continuing right up until she'd met Marcus. She'd essentially built her entire adult life on a foundation of lies and manipulation, presenting herself as someone responsible and trustworthy while systematically deceiving the people who trusted her. But the most interesting discovery was related to her relationship with Marcus. According to James's investigation, Jessica had specifically targeted Marcus after researching his background and determining that he came from a financially stable family. She'd met him at a professional networking event, but she'd done extensive research on his employer, his salary, and his family situation before ever approaching him for a conversation. The courtship that Marcus remembered as a romantic whirlwind had actually been a calculated campaign designed to secure access to the financial resources she needed to rebuild her life after the bankruptcy. She'd presented herself as the perfect partner for a man with his background and income level, while carefully concealing the financial chaos that had characterized her life before they met. Marcus wasn't just Jessica's husband. He was her Mark. And I wasn't just an inconvenient mother-in-law. I was a witness to her deception and a potential threat to the financial security she'd worked so hard to achieve through marriage. Her hostility toward me wasn't about parenting philosophy or personality conflicts. It was about eliminating someone who might eventually discover the truth about who she really was. Armed with this information, I began to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Jessica wasn't just a difficult daughter-in-law who needed to be managed through patience and accommodation. She was someone capable of sustained deception and financial manipulation. Someone who had built her entire relationship with my son on a foundation of lies. The question was whether Marcus would be able to handle the truth about his wife, or whether discovering her real background would destroy him emotionally. I loved my son enough to want to protect him from that kind of devastating revelation, but I also loved him enough to want him to understand what kind of person he'd married and what kind of future he was building with someone who had such a casual relationship with honesty. For now, I decided to continue with the financial pressure strategy and see how Jessica responded when her comfortable lifestyle began unraveling. If she was capable of change, If she could acknowledge her mistakes and commit to treating me with basic respect, then perhaps the marriage could be salvaged without exposing all of her deceptions. But if she continued to see me as the enemy, if she doubled down on her hostility and tried to turn Marcus against me even more completely, then I would be forced to share the information I'd gathered about her background. Not out of spite or revenge, but out of love for my son and granddaughter, who deserved to know the truth about the person who claimed to love them. Monday morning brought the phone call I'd been expecting. This time, it was Jessica who called, her voice tight with barely controlled anger and frustration. She'd clearly decided that a direct confrontation was preferable to working through Marcus, and I was curious to see how she'd approach a conversation she'd been avoiding for 5 years. "Evelyn, we need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of authority she probably used in professional settings when she needed to intimidate subordinates. "Marcus is upset about these financial changes you're making, and I think there's been some kind of miscommunication." "There's been no miscommunication," I said calmly, settling back in my office chair and preparing to enjoy what was likely to be a very revealing conversation. "I've simply decided to redirect my financial resources toward people and causes that treat me with appreciation and respect." "This is about Thanksgiving, isn't it?" Jessica said, her voice taking on a note of exasperated patience, as if she were dealing with a child having an emotional tantrum. "Look, I'm sorry if my comments about the food came across as criticism. I was trying to be helpful, but maybe my delivery wasn't as tactful as it could have been." The non-apology was exactly what I'd expected from someone like Jessica. She was sorry that I'd misinterpreted her helpful comments, sorry that my sensitivity had created a problem, sorry that the situation had gotten out of hand. But she wasn't actually sorry for calling me useless, for questioning my competence, or for spending 5 years treating me like an unwelcome burden. "Jessica," I said, my voice carrying the kind of professional authority I'd learned during decades of managing difficult clients and hostile negotiations. "Let's be very clear about what happened at Thanksgiving. You didn't offer tactless feedback about my cooking. You systematically insulted every aspect of the meal I'd spent 3 days preparing, questioned my competence as a cook and a grandmother, and culminated the evening by calling me useless in my own dining room." "I never called you useless," she protested, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested she knew exactly what she'd said and was hoping to gaslight me into doubting my own memory. "You said that older people like me were out of touch with modern standards and that my contributions to your family were outdated and unnecessary," I replied smoothly. "When I pointed out that I'd been cooking successfully for 35 years, you said that experience doesn't always equal expertise and that at my age I might not notice the subtle signs of food safety problems." Those weren't helpful suggestions, Jessica. They were calculated insults designed to make me feel incompetent and unwelcome. The silence that followed was thick with tension, and I could almost hear her trying to figure out how to respond to someone who had clearly been paying much closer attention to her behavior than she'd realized. Jessica was accustomed to getting away with her subtle cruelties, because most people either didn't notice them or chose to ignore them in the interest of maintaining family harmony. But I was no longer interested in maintaining harmony at the expense of my own dignity, and I wasn't going to pretend that her behavior had been acceptable just to make her feel better about herself. "Fine," she said finally, her voice shifting to a different register, harder and more openly hostile. "Maybe I was more direct than I should have been. But honestly, Evelyn, you do tend to be a little overwhelming sometimes. The elaborate meals, the constant gift-giving, the way you hover around Lily like she might disappear if you're not watching her every second. It's a lot to handle, and sometimes people need space to breathe." There it was, the real Jessica finally emerging from behind the facade of polite concern. She wasn't sorry for her behavior. She was angry that her behavior had consequences. She wasn't worried about my feelings. She was worried about losing access to my financial support. And she wasn't interested in improving our relationship. She was interested in manipulating me back into the role of the grateful, accommodating mother-in-law who absorbed insults without complaint. "I see," I said, my voice cooling by several degrees. "So your position is that I'm the problem. I'm too overwhelming, too involved, too generous. My love for my son and granddaughter is actually a burden that you're forced to tolerate, and I should be grateful that you allow me any access to them at all." "That's not what I'm saying." Jessica backtracked quickly, apparently realizing that her honesty had revealed more than she'd intended. "I'm just saying that maybe we could find a better balance. Maybe we could set some boundaries that work for everyone. We already tried that approach, I reminded her. For 5 years, I accepted every boundary you established, adjusted my behavior to accommodate every preference you expressed, and continued providing financial support, even when you made it clear that my presence in your lives was barely tolerable. But that wasn't enough for you, was it? You couldn't be satisfied with controlling my access to Lily and limiting my involvement in family decisions. You needed to humiliate me in my own home to make sure I understood my place in your hierarchy. Look, we're getting off track here, Jessica said, her voice taking on a note of desperation as she realized the conversation wasn't going the way she'd planned. The important thing is that Marcus and I need to be able to count on certain financial arrangements. We've built our budget around the support you've been providing, and sudden changes create real hardships for our family. Your family, I repeated, emphasizing the possessive pronoun. Not our family. Not the family. Your family, which apparently doesn't include me except as a source of financial resources that can be tapped when convenient, and dismissed when inconvenient. You're twisting my words, Jessica said angrily. Of course you're part of the family. But that doesn't mean we can't have disagreements, or that every conversation has to revolve around managing your feelings. You're absolutely right, I agreed, my voice becoming warmer and more pleasant. Family members can certainly have disagreements, and not every conversation should revolve around managing feelings. So let's have an honest family conversation about expectations and contributions. I paused, letting the false warmth in my voice settle before delivering the information that would change everything between us. I've been contributing approximately $8,000 per year to your household through direct payments, gifts, credit card authorizations, insurance supplements, and service subscriptions. That money has been funding everything from Lily's daycare tuition, to your organic grocery deliveries, to the vacation you took to Cabo last spring. The silence that followed was absolute, and I knew that Jessica was processing the implications of what I'd just said. She'd probably never calculated the total value of my contributions because she'd grown so accustomed to receiving them that they'd become invisible, just part of the background support that enabled her comfortable lifestyle. $8,000, I continued, my voice still pleasant and conversational, is a significant amount of money for someone on Marcus's salary. Losing that support represents approximately a 15% reduction in your household's effective income. That's the kind of financial impact that typically requires major lifestyle adjustments, particularly for families who are already living paycheck to paycheck. We're not living paycheck to paycheck, Jessica said quickly, but her voice carried a defensive edge that suggested I'd hit very close to the truth. According to my research, your mortgage payment consumes 31% of Marcus's take-home pay, which is above the recommended threshold for housing costs, I said, consulting the notes I'd prepared for this conversation. Add in your car payments, student loan obligations, credit card minimums, and basic living expenses, and you're operating with very little margin for unexpected costs or income disruptions. The silence stretched longer this time, and I could almost hear her trying to figure out how I'd obtained such detailed information about their financial situation. She was probably wondering whether Marcus had shared those details with me, or whether I'd discovered them through some other means. The point is, I continued, that calling someone useless, while simultaneously depending on their financial support, demonstrates a level of poor judgment that raises questions about your ability to make sound decisions for your family. If I'm truly as irrelevant as you suggested, then losing my contributions shouldn't create any significant hardship for your household. This is ridiculous, Jessica said, her voice rising with frustration and what sounded like the beginning of panic. You can't just punish our entire family because your feelings got hurt over some comments about turkey. I'm not punishing anyone, I corrected gently. I'm simply respecting your assessment of my value by adjusting my contributions accordingly. If my involvement in your lives is overwhelming and unwelcome, then reducing that involvement should be a positive change that everyone can appreciate. And what about Lily? Jessica demanded, playing what she clearly thought was her strongest card. Are you really going to damage your relationship with your granddaughter just to prove a point? The question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had been driving Jessica's behavior for years. She thought my love for Lily could be used as leverage to force me to accept her mistreatment, that my desire to maintain a relationship with my granddaughter would make me willing to tolerate any level of disrespect from her mother. My relationship with Lily has never been contingent on providing financial support to her parents, I said calmly. If you choose to limit my access to her because I'm no longer subsidizing your lifestyle, that says everything about your priorities and nothing about mine. The conversation ended abruptly after that, with Jessica hanging up without another word. But I wasn't concerned about her anger or her threats to limit my access to Lily. Jessica had just revealed the extent to which she'd been counting on my financial support, and her panic suggested that losing it would create exactly the kind of pressure I'd been hoping to achieve. More importantly, she'd confirmed that her treatment of me had been calculated and deliberate, rather than the result of personality conflicts or misunderstandings. She wasn't sorry for her behavior, she was sorry it had consequences. She wasn't interested in improving our relationship. She was interested in maintaining access to my resources while continuing to treat me with contempt. That clarity was exactly what I needed to move forward with the next phase of my plan. Jessica had shown me who she really was, and now it was time to show her who I really was. The woman she'd called useless was about to demonstrate the difference between useful and indispensable, and the lesson was going to be more expensive than anything she could possibly have imagined. The silence that followed Jessica's abrupt hang-up was profound, the kind of quiet that settles over a battlefield after the last shot has been fired. I sat in my office chair, looking out at the December snow beginning to dust my backyard, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from finally speaking your truth after years of swallowing it. Jessica had revealed herself completely in that conversation, stripping away any pretense that her hostility toward me was based on legitimate concerns or reasonable boundaries. She was angry that her behavior had consequences, panicked that her comfortable lifestyle was threatened, and completely unable to comprehend that her treatment of me might have been genuinely hurtful, rather than merely inconvenient. The woman who had spent 5 years calling me outdated and useless had just begged me to continue funding her life, apparently unable to see the contradiction in her position. But the real revelation was her threat to limit my access to Lily if I didn't resume my financial support. She'd essentially admitted that my relationship with my granddaughter was contingent on my willingness to bankroll her parents' lifestyle, that love and family connection were commodities she was prepared to withhold if I didn't meet her financial demands. The mask had finally slipped completely, and I could see exactly what kind of person my son had married. Over the next few days, I received several more calls from Marcus, each one more desperate than the last. The financial pressure I'd created was working exactly as intended, forcing them to confront the reality of their actual income versus their assumed lifestyle. Without my supplements and safety nets, they were discovering that their comfortable middle-class life had been an illusion built on my generosity. "Mom, the mortgage payment is due next week, and we're short," Marcus said during his Thursday evening call, his voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent staring at bank balances and calculator screens. "The daycare wants their money up front, now that you're not covering half the tuition, and Jessica's car payment got returned for insufficient funds." "That sounds very stressful," I said sympathetically, genuinely feeling sorry for my son even as I recognized that this pressure was necessary to break through years of willful blindness about his family's financial situation. "Have you considered adjusting your budget to reflect your actual income?" "We can't cut anything else," he said desperately. "We've already canceled the streaming services and the grocery delivery. Jessica's talking about pulling Lily out of daycare and trying to work from home, but her job requires client meetings and travel. We need those services, Mom. We've built our whole life around having them." "You've built your whole life around having my financial support," I corrected gently. "Those services were never part of Marcus's salary or Jessica's income. They were gifts I provided because I wanted to help you succeed, and because I thought you appreciated that help." "We do appreciate it," Marcus said quickly. "Of course we appreciate everything you've done for us. It's just that Jessica feels like there are some communication issues between you two, and maybe if you could find a way to work through those differences." "Marcus," I interrupted, my patience finally beginning to fray after days of these circular conversations. "Your wife called me useless in my own home after I spent 3 days preparing a Thanksgiving dinner that she proceeded to criticize from the moment she walked through my door. She spent 5 years treating me like an unwelcome burden while simultaneously building her lifestyle around my financial contributions. These aren't communication issues that can be resolved through better dialogue. These are character issues that reflect who she is as a person. The silence that followed was heavy, with the weight of truths that Marcus had been avoiding for years. He knew I was right about Jessica's behavior, but acknowledging it would require him to confront some very uncomfortable realities about his marriage and his own role in enabling his wife's treatment of his mother. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally, his voice small and defeated. "Do you want me to choose between my wife and my mother? Because that's what this feels like, and I don't know how to make that choice." "I want you to grow a backbone," I said firmly, using the kind of direct language I should have used years earlier. "I want you to stop pretending that Jessica's behavior toward me is acceptable, and I want you to start acting like a man who cares about his mother's dignity and feelings. I don't need you to choose between us, Marcus. I need you to demand that your wife treat me with basic respect." "But she's the mother of my child," he said weakly. "I have to live with her every day. If I push too hard on this, it could destroy our marriage." "Your marriage is already in trouble," I said bluntly. "You've just been so focused on keeping the peace that you haven't noticed the foundation crumbling underneath you. A relationship built on financial dependency and mutual deception isn't sustainable, and the sooner you recognize that, the better off you and Lily will be." After that conversation ended, I knew that Marcus wasn't going to be able to solve this problem through confrontation or negotiation with Jessica. He was too conflict-averse, too dependent on her approval, and too frightened of the consequences of challenging her behavior. If anything was going to change, it would have to come from external pressure that forced both of them to confront realities they'd been avoiding. That external pressure arrived the following Monday in the form of a certified letter from the bank holding their mortgage. The loan review I'd requested had been completed, and the findings were exactly what I'd expected. Marcus and Jessica's debt-to-income ratio had deteriorated significantly. Since the original loan approval, their credit utilization had increased to dangerous levels, and their payment history showed several recent late fees and overdraft charges. Based on these findings, the bank was implementing several changes to the loan terms. The interest rate would increase by 2 percentage points effective immediately, reflecting the increased risk associated with their current financial profile. They would be required to provide monthly financial statements for the next year to monitor their ability to maintain payments. And most significantly, they would need to secure additional collateral or find a replacement cosigner within 60 days, or face immediate acceleration of the loan balance. I received a copy of the letter as the cosigner, and I spent several minutes savoring the precise, bureaucratic language that was about to turn Jessica's world upside down. The monthly payment increase alone would add nearly $400 to their housing costs, money they didn't have even before I'd withdrawn my support. The additional collateral requirement would force them to liquidate assets or find family members willing to put their own financial security at risk to support Marcus and Jessica's lifestyle. But the real beauty of the situation was that none of these consequences could be blamed on me directly. This was the bank responding to Marcus and Jessica's actual financial situation, using the standard risk assessment protocols that governed all mortgage lending. I hadn't caused their debt problems or their cash flow issues. I'd simply stopped masking them with my subsidies. The phone call came within hours of the letter's delivery, and this time Marcus sounded truly panicked rather than merely stressed. "Mom, we got this letter from the mortgage company, and I think there's been some kind of mistake. They're saying we need to find a new cosigner or pay off the entire loan balance within 2 months. That's impossible. We don't have that kind of money." "It's not a mistake," I said calmly. "I requested a loan review to assess my ongoing liability as a cosigner, and the bank discovered that your financial situation has deteriorated significantly since the original loan was approved. They're protecting their investment by requiring additional security." "You requested a loan review?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising with a combination of shock and betrayal. "Why would you do that? You know we've been making our payments on time every month." "Because I needed to understand the full scope of my financial obligations before making decisions about my ongoing support," I explained. "As a cosigner, I'm legally responsible for your mortgage payments if you default, and recent changes in your spending patterns and debt levels suggested that default was becoming increasingly likely. We would never default on our house payment, Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew that without my financial support, their budget was stretched far beyond its limits. Marcus, you just told me last week that you were short on the mortgage payment, I reminded him. How can you promise you'll never default when you're already struggling to make the monthly payments? The silence that followed was filled with the sound of Marcus's carefully constructed worldview finally collapsing. For years, he'd been living in a fantasy where his income was sufficient to support his family's lifestyle, where Jessica's spending was reasonable and sustainable, where my contributions were nice supplements rather than essential supports. The bank's letter had shattered that fantasy and forced him to confront the mathematical reality of his situation. What am I supposed to do? He asked finally, his voice breaking slightly. We can't lose the house. Lily's whole life is here. Her daycare, her friends, her room with all her toys. How do I explain to a 2-year-old that we have to move because Grandma decided to punish us? I'm not punishing you, I said firmly. I'm allowing you to experience the natural consequences of financial decisions you made without considering their long-term sustainability. If you can't afford your mortgage without my help, then you couldn't actually afford the house in the first place. But you encouraged us to buy it, Marcus said desperately. You said it was a good investment, a safe neighborhood for Lily to grow up in. You helped us with the down payment and co-signed the loan because you believed in our ability to make it work. I believed in your potential, I corrected. I thought that helping you get established would enable you to build financial independence and stability. Instead, you used my support as a foundation for increasing your spending and living beyond your means. The house was supposed to be a stepping stone, not a permanent subsidy requirement. After that conversation, I knew that the financial pressure alone wasn't going to be sufficient to create the changes I wanted to see. Marcus was too focused on finding ways to maintain his current lifestyle, rather than addressing the fundamental problems in his marriage and his relationship with money. Jessica was too invested in her victim narrative to acknowledge her role in creating the crisis they were facing. It was time to deploy the information James Morrison had gathered about Jessica's background, not as a weapon of revenge, but as a tool for helping my son understand who he'd really married and what kind of future he was building with someone who had such a casual relationship with honesty and financial responsibility. I called Marcus and asked him to come over for dinner on Saturday, alone. I need to share some information with you that might be difficult to hear, but that you need to know as you're making decisions about your family's future, I told him. This isn't about punishing you or Jessica. It's about making sure you have all the facts before you decide how to handle the current financial crisis. Marcus arrived looking haggard and defeated, the stress of the past few weeks evident in the dark circles under his eyes and the way his clothes hung loosely on his frame. He'd clearly been losing sleep and probably skipping meals, trying to find solutions to problems that had no easy answers. I made his favorite dinner, the same beef stew I'd been cooking since he was a child, served with homemade bread and the kind of simple green salad that didn't require organic ingredients or specialized preparation techniques. We ate in comfortable silence for the first few minutes, both of us savoring the temporary peace that came from focusing on something as basic and uncomplicated as sharing a meal. Marcus, I said finally, setting down my fork and reaching for the manila envelope I'd placed on the sideboard before he arrived. Before we talk about solutions to your current financial situation, there are some things you need to know about Jessica's background that she hasn't shared with you. His face immediately became guarded, the expression of someone who sensed that his world was about to shift in ways he couldn't control or predict. What kind of things? Things about her education, her employment history, her financial past, and the circumstances that led to your meeting, I said gently, opening the envelope and spreading the documents across the table between us. I hired a private investigator to verify some information, and the findings raised serious questions about the foundation of your marriage. You hired a private investigator to spy on my wife? Marcus said, his voice rising with indignation. Mom, that's completely inappropriate. What gives you the right to invade our privacy like that? The right of someone who's been providing significant financial support to your household while being systematically lied to about the people receiving that support, I said firmly. Marcus, Jessica filed for bankruptcy 18 months before she met you, discharging over $30,000 in debt. She was fired from her previous job for falsifying expense reports and stealing from her employer. She doesn't have the college degree she claims to have, and her entire professional resume is fabricated. I slid the documents across the table, watching his face as he began to process the information. Bank records, court filings, employment termination letters, educational verification reports. A comprehensive picture of someone who had built her entire adult identity on a foundation of lies and financial irresponsibility. "This can't be right," Marcus said, his voice hollow as he flipped through page after page of evidence. "She showed me her diploma. We talked about her college experiences, her professors, her sorority friends." "The diploma is fake," I said quietly. "She attended community college for 2 semesters, but never completed any degree program. The stories about her college experiences were fabricated, probably based on research she did about the school she claimed to attend." Marcus continued reading, his face growing paler with each revelation. The bankruptcy filing detailed a pattern of irresponsible spending and financial deception that extended back to her early 20s. The employment termination documents showed that she'd been stealing from her employer for months before being caught and fired. The educational records showed that her entire professional identity was built on credentials she didn't actually possess. But why would she lie about all of this? Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. What was the point of building a relationship based on deception? Because you represented financial stability and social respectability that she couldn't achieve on her own, I explained gently. According to the investigator's report, she specifically targeted you after researching your background and determining that you came from a financially stable family with resources that could help her rebuild her life after the bankruptcy. I pulled out another set of documents, these ones showing Jessica's internet search history and social media activity in the months before she'd met Marcus. She'd researched his employer, his salary range, his family background, even the neighborhood where I lived, and the estimated value of my house. The courtship that Marcus remembered as a romantic whirlwind had actually been a calculated campaign designed to secure access to the financial resources she needed. She targeted me, Marcus repeated slowly, the words sinking in like stones dropped into still water. Our entire relationship, our marriage, Lily, it was all part of some kind of financial plan? I don't think she necessarily planned to have a child or to stay married long term, I said carefully. But once Lily was born, the marriage became much more valuable to her. A divorce would mean losing access to your income and my financial support, plus potential child support obligations that would be difficult to meet given her actual employment situation. Marcus put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly as the full implications of what he'd learned began to settle in. The woman he'd thought he married didn't actually exist. The partnership he'd believed he was building was actually a carefully constructed deception, designed to exploit his resources and his family's generosity. What about Lily? He asked finally, his voice muffled by his hands. Is she even... did Jessica plan to get pregnant? Or was that part of the deception too? According to the timeline, Lily was conceived about 6 months after the wedding, right around the time Jessica would have been eligible for your health insurance and other employment benefits, I said gently. I can't know her motivations for certain, but the timing suggests that the pregnancy might have been strategic rather than accidental. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that settles over a life when all the familiar landmarks have suddenly disappeared. Marcus was processing the destruction of everything he'd believed about his marriage, his wife, and his own judgment. The woman he'd thought he loved didn't exist, and the woman he'd actually married had been systematically deceiving him for years. I need to confront her about this, he said finally, his voice carrying a new quality, harder and more determined than I'd heard from him in years. I need to hear her explanation for why she lied about everything. Before you do that, I said carefully, you need to think about what outcome you're hoping to achieve. Are you looking for an apology, an explanation, or are you trying to decide whether the marriage can be salvaged? I don't know, Marcus admitted. I don't even know who I married anymore. How do you rebuild trust with someone who's been lying about their entire identity since the day you met them? You don't, I said simply. Trust isn't something that can be rebuilt after this level of deception. At best, You might be able to create some kind of functional co-parenting arrangement that protects Lily while acknowledging the reality of what Jessica is capable of. Over the next few hours, we talked through the practical implications of what Marcus had learned. The financial crisis they were facing was actually just the beginning of their problems, because Jessica's history of bankruptcy and employment fraud suggested that she was unlikely to be able to contribute significantly to solving their current difficulties. More importantly, the systematic deception she'd maintained throughout their relationship indicated that she was capable of much more serious financial crimes if she felt cornered or desperate. Marcus needed to protect his assets, his credit, and his employment situation from someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to engage in fraud and theft when it served her purposes. "I think you should consult with a divorce attorney," I said as we were finishing our conversation. "Not necessarily to file for divorce immediately, but to understand your options and protect yourself legally. If Jessica realizes that you've discovered her deceptions, she might become desperate enough to do something that could damage your financial situation or your reputation at work." "A divorce attorney," Marcus repeated, as if the words belonged to a foreign language he was still learning to speak. 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect marriage, the perfect family, the perfect life. Now you're telling me I need to protect myself from my own wife. I'm telling you that you need to protect yourself and Lily from someone who has been systematically deceiving you for years," I corrected gently. "The perfect marriage you thought you had was an illusion created by someone who needed you to believe in it to achieve her own goals." After Marcus left that evening, I sat in my quiet house and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally out in the open, sadness for my son's pain, and a deep satisfaction that Jessica's carefully constructed deception was finally beginning to unravel. She'd spent 5 years treating me like an obstacle to be managed and a resource to be exploited, never realizing that I was actually the key to her entire financial security. Now that key was being withdrawn, and the house of lies she'd built was beginning to collapse under its own weight. The mortgage crisis, the loss of financial support, and Marcus's discovery of her deceptions would combine to create exactly the kind of systematic pressure that would force her to reveal her true character. Over the next few days, I waited to see how Jessica would respond to the crisis engulfing her carefully planned life. Would she double down on her deceptions and try to manipulate Marcus into believing that I was the real villain in their story? Would she become desperate enough to attempt some kind of financial fraud that would expose her to criminal prosecution? Or would she finally be forced to acknowledge the truth about who she was and what she'd done? The answer came sooner than I'd expected, in the form of a frantic phone call from Marcus on Wednesday evening. "Mom, Jessica's gone," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a mixture of panic and relief. "She took Lily and left this morning while I was at work. She cleaned out our bank accounts and took everything of value that she could carry. Do you know where she went?" I asked, already reaching for the notebook where I'd been tracking the various elements of my plan. "I have no idea," Marcus said. "She left a note saying that she needed time to think about our relationship and that she'd be in touch when she was ready to discuss the future. But she took my grandmother's jewelry, the emergency cash we kept in the house, even the silver service set you gave us for our wedding. This wasn't someone going away to think, Mom. This was someone running away with everything she could steal." "Have you called the police?" I asked. "I called them about the theft, but they said it's complicated because we're married and most of the items were technically joint property," Marcus explained. "As for Lily, there's no custody order in place, so Jessica has the legal right to take her anywhere she wants. The police can't help unless I can prove that Lily is in immediate danger. But you can track her through her phone, her credit cards, her social media accounts," I suggested. "She left her phone behind and canceled all her social media accounts," Marcus said. "I called the credit card companies, and she maxed out all our cards yesterday with cash advances before she left. She's been planning this for days, maybe weeks." The systematic nature of Jessica's disappearance confirmed what I'd suspected about her character. When faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed deception, she hadn't chosen to fight or negotiate or attempt to repair the damage. She'd chosen to cut her losses and run, taking whatever value she could extract from the situation and abandoning everything else. But in her haste to escape the consequences of her actions, Jessica had made a critical error. She'd assumed that disappearing with Lily would be her trump card, the ultimate leverage that would force Marcus and me to negotiate on her terms. She'd believed that our love for the little girl would make us willing to accept any conditions she set for Lily's return. What she didn't understand was that I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario from the moment I'd learned about her deceptions. The private investigator I'd hired wasn't just skilled at uncovering information about the past. He was also excellent at tracking people who thought they could disappear without leaving a trail. "Marcus," I said calmly, "I want you to come over here tomorrow morning. Bring all the information you have about Jessica's disappearance, including copies of the note she left and records of the financial accounts she emptied. I have some resources that might be helpful in locating her and Lily." "What kind of resources?" Marcus asked. "The kind that money can buy when you've spent 30 years learning how financial systems work and how people try to hide within them," I said. "Jessica may think she's clever, but she's made several mistakes that will make it possible to track her movements and predict her next steps." The next morning, Marcus arrived with a folder full of documentation about Jessica's disappearance, and I spread the information across my dining room table alongside the investigative reports I'd been accumulating. Together, they painted a clear picture of someone who had been planning her exit strategy for much longer than either of us had realized. "Look at this pattern of cash withdrawals," I said, pointing to the bank statements from the past month. "She's been taking small amounts regularly, never enough to trigger any automatic alerts, but sufficient to accumulate several $1,000s in untraceable currency. She's also been selling items online, jewelry and electronics that she claimed were damaged or lost." Marcus studied the papers with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that would determine his daughter's future. "So she's been planning to disappear for weeks, maybe months." "At least that long," I confirmed. "But here's what she didn't anticipate. People who disappear with children have very limited options for supporting themselves without leaving trails that can be followed. She'll need housing, childcare, medical care for Lily, and eventually some kind of employment. All of those things require documentation and create records." I reached for my phone and dialed James Morrison's number. When he answered, I explained the situation and asked whether he could expand his investigation to include real-time tracking of Jessica's movements and activities. "Missing person cases involving child abduction are serious business," James said. "I'll need to coordinate with law enforcement to make sure we're not interfering with any official investigation. But there are definitely steps we can take to locate her." "How quickly do you need results?" "As quickly as possible," I said. "Every day she's gone increases the risk that she'll do something desperate or dangerous." Within 48 hours, James had tracked Jessica to a cheap motel 3 states away, where she was registered under her maiden name and paying cash for weekly room rentals. He'd also identified the vehicle she was driving, a used car she'd purchased with cash from a private seller the day before she disappeared. "She's trying to stay off the grid, but she's made several mistakes," James explained during our phone conversation. "She used her real Social Security number when she enrolled Lily in a drop-in daycare center, and she's been making purchases at stores with security cameras. We have a clear trail of her movements and a good prediction of where she'll be in the next few days." "Is Lily safe?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with worry. "From what we can observe, the child appears to be physically safe," James said carefully. "But the living conditions are concerning. The motel is in a rough area, and your wife appears to be struggling financially, despite the money she took when she left." Armed with this information, Marcus was able to work with local law enforcement to locate Jessica and begin the process of securing Lily's return. But more importantly, Jessica's flight with their daughter had provided the final evidence needed to demonstrate that she was unfit to have custody of a 2-year-old child. The woman who had spent 5 years criticizing my parenting and questioning my judgment had just proven that her own decision-making was so poor that she would endanger her child's welfare rather than face the consequences of her deceptions. The woman who had called me useless had just demonstrated her own complete inability to handle adult responsibilities in a crisis situation. When the police located Jessica and Lily at the motel, the scene was exactly what I'd expected. Jessica was discovered in a state of complete breakdown, surrounded by empty takeout containers and unpaid bills, while Lily was dirty, hungry, and clearly distressed by the unfamiliar environment and her mother's emotional instability. Jessica was arrested on charges of child endangerment, theft, and fraud related to the credit card cash advances she'd taken before disappearing. Lily was placed in temporary custody with Marcus while the courts worked through the legal implications of Jessica's actions. But the real resolution came when Jessica, faced with the reality of potential prison time and the loss of custody of her daughter, finally agreed to a plea bargain that included full restitution of the money she'd stolen, permanent relinquishment of any claims to Marcus's assets, and supervised visitation rights that could be revoked if she violated any of the terms of her probation. The woman who had built her life on deception and manipulation had finally been forced to confront the reality of her choices. The comfortable lifestyle she'd created through lies and financial exploitation was gone, replaced by the kind of genuine accountability she'd spent years trying to avoid. Marcus kept the house by refinancing the mortgage without Jessica's involvement, and I resumed providing modest financial support now that it was going to someone who appreciated it, rather than someone who treated it as an entitlement. Lily moved back into her familiar room and resumed attending her regular daycare, where she could rebuild the stability and security that Jessica's selfish choices had temporarily disrupted. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when Marcus brought Lily over for Sunday dinner and she ran into my arms with the kind of unguarded joy that only children possess. She had no memory of the chaos Jessica had created, no understanding of the lies and manipulations that had nearly destroyed our family. She just knew that Grandma's house was a place where she was loved unconditionally, and where the food was always good. As I watched Marcus help Lily color in one of the activity books I kept for her visits, I reflected on the lesson Jessica had ultimately taught me. She'd called me useless because she genuinely believed that my age and traditional values made me irrelevant in the modern world. She'd seen my kindness as weakness, my generosity as desperation, and my patience as evidence that I could be manipulated without consequence. But what she'd failed to understand was that usefulness isn't about age or style or the particular ways you choose to express your love. Usefulness is about competence, resources, and the willingness to use both effectively when the situation demands it. I'd spent 30 years building financial expertise and professional networks that had ultimately proven essential to protecting my family from someone who had infiltrated it with criminal intent. The woman Jessica had dismissed as a useless relic had ultimately been the one with the skills and resources necessary to expose her deceptions and ensure her granddaughter's safety. The elaborate Thanksgiving dinner she'd criticized had been prepared by someone who understood the value of tradition, family, and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't depend on performance or perfection. Jessica had called me useless, but in the end, she'd been the one whose contributions to our family had proven to be worthless. Her lies, her manipulations, and her willingness to endanger her own child in service of her selfish goals had added nothing of value to any of our lives. She'd been the useless one all along, and now everyone could see it clearly. As I tucked Lily into the guest room bed that had become hers during her weekend visits, she looked up at me with Marcus's eyes and said, "Grandma, will you make turkey again for Thanksgiving?" "Of course, sweetheart," I said, kissing her forehead and smoothing her hair. "We'll make the biggest, most perfect turkey you've ever seen. And this time, there would be no one at my table who didn't appreciate it." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.